The Flood are detrimental to Halo and should never make a return to the series. That line, or a variation of it, is one I've heard spoken many times over the years, in response to some suggesting that it's perhaps time for gaming's most infamous space zombies to make a return after a near 16-year absence from the series. Personally, I think we've lived in a cruel, floodless world for more than long enough, and if handled properly, their reintroduction to the series could help give Halo the kick up the backside it most certainly needs. In fact, there is a golden opportunity for whoever develops the next game in the series to do something really special, if they follow a few simple learnings from the Flood's previous appearances. The first, and in my mind perhaps most important thing, is that a modicum of restraint needs to be shown. There are few reveals more shocking than the Flood's arrival around Halo Combat Evolved's midway point. At the end of Assault on the Control Room, things suddenly begin to take a dark turn as Cortana very quickly gets very concerned about something.
The Covenant found something, buried in this ring, something horrible, and now they're afraid.
Something buried? Where?
The captain, we've got to stop the captain.
Keys?
The weapons cache he's looking for, it's not really... We can't let him get inside.
I don't understand.
There's no time. Get out of here, find keys, stop him. Before it's too late!
Before you know it, you find yourself in control of Master Chief in a dark, foggy swamp, a setting which instills a great sense of unease. Searching for Captain Keyes, you may well notice a few things out of the ordinary, such as a voice on the radio speaking of some new kind of hostile, or shadowy figures lurking in the distance, and upon entering the nearby facility, things are no less eerie. In certain areas, it looks like a bloodbath has occurred, strange yellow matter drips from ceilings, and a crazed Marine rants about events you seemingly just managed to miss. Eventually, you find a helmet cam recording made by one of Keyes' team which reveals the Flood, and they then make their presence known in the present as all hell breaks loose around you. Fighting your way to the surface, you soon meet up with a group of Marines, flee with them through the swamp, and are saved by Guilty Spark and his gaggle of sentinels. 343 Guilty Spark is the gold standard for a level centred on the Flood in so many ways, but particularly in how it builds suspense using its foreboding atmosphere and terrific environmental storytelling. It's a slow burn nightmare that is allowed time to get under your skin, with Bungie showing a tremendous amount of self-control. It would have been tempting, I'm sure, to have the Flood appear instantly, but they instead err on the side of subtlety, which works wonders. Bungie did attempt to make lightning strike twice at the beginning of the Oracle in Halo 2, with Flood biomatter splattered all over the walls and a fight between heretics and the Flood breaking out directly below you. However, it feels very rushed. Where in 343 Guilty Spark, you have been on the edge of your seat for a good while by the time the Flood arrive, in the Oracle you barely have time to blink before they're introduced. The same is true of Floodgate in Halo 3 as well. As much as I enjoy the brief combat-free moments we do get, with Flood leaping across the rooftops in the burning city of Voi, they're fleeting at best. To be fair to Bungie, in 2 and 3 we expected the Flood to turn up, and so their entrance was never going to be a real surprise, but that won't be the case if they make a return nowadays. What I'd love to see is an attempt at replicating the environmental storytelling over a sustained period of time which 343 Guilty Spark excelled at. Of course, we'll still suspect that it's the Flood, but that doesn't mean it's not worth trying. Halo is an action-packed series, and consequently the slower moments which give certain parts of the story time to breathe can often be the most impactful, especially those focused on something as unsettling as the Flood. Even with a masterfully crafted build-up to the Flood's return, there's still a lot of work to do, and when it comes to crafting levels involving them, there are two areas with huge room for improvement. One is the way the Flood are integrated into Halo's Sandbox. I don't know about you, but whenever I think about the Flood, the first thing I think of is on-foot combat. 343 Guilty Spark in Combat Evolved is followed by the Library, 2 Betrayals, Keys and the More, and out of all of them it's perhaps no surprise that the best mission is 2 Betrayals. The others mostly feel like extensions of 343 Guilty Spark's gameplay in the facility immediately following the Flood's reveal, that is frantic combat in narrow corridors, and in my mind a lot of the time none of them feel as much like like traditional Halo as I would like. By comparison, Two Betrayals feels like much of Combat Evolved's first half, open and incredibly varied, except the Flood are also present. There are still indoor sections which can be frustrating, but that teeny tiny dark cloud has a whopper of a silver lining, which is the massive multi-faction battles you regularly stumble across. Halo 2 came so close to getting things right. It has some of the worst Flood levels in the entire series. The Oracle and High Charity spring to mind, but Sacred Icon and Quarantine Zone were absolutely a missed opportunity. I've spoken about this before, and it still pains me to this day. If those two missions had been combined, the result could have been spectacular. Sacred Icon is not a brilliant level with far too much repetition, and Quarantine Zone is also middling but elevated by it being the only occasion in the series where the Flood take control of vehicles. Splicing them together to create something more in the mould of Assault on the Control Room, with you swapping between indoor and outdoor segments regularly, and Two Betrayals with its greater focus on multi-faction encounters, and I think you'd have been left with something quite brilliant. By the time Bungie arrived at Halo 3, it was pretty clear they weren't really sure what to do with the Flood, and so they are mostly kept separate from much of what the game has to offer. Floodgate and Cortana are both experiences in the mould of what you'd likely had come to expect after Combat Evolved in 2. They are very linear, they take place in less expansive environments than most others, and there's a general lack of variety. Even in the Covenant, the most diverse outing in the entire series, they're confined to a relatively unexciting indoor area and this admittedly brilliant sequence.
Do not shoot, but listen. Let me lead you safely to our foe. Only you can halt what he has set in motion.
Halo, which concludes 3, has its opening in the snow and the fight up to the control room, which is good fun, but again, it only serves to highlight how disconnected from the game's wider sandbox the Flood usually are. What I'm getting at here is that if the Flood are to return, then they must be considered a fundamental part of Halo's sandbox. While they definitely have their moments in Bungie's trilogy, my view is that they have actually been underutilised so far, and are too often separated from a lot of what makes the games such a joy to play. If whoever brings them back can find a way to properly integrate them into the sandbox rather than keeping them away from much of it, I think they could well score a home run. The second gripe I have with Flood levels is their lack of environmental diversity, and here again there is real scope for refinement. There's a long list of missions which struggle with this particular problem, almost every single one in the series honestly. The Library, Keys and the More in Combat Evolved, the Oracle, Sacred Icon and High Charity in 2, and Cortana in 3 being by far the worst offenders. While some of them do have their moments, they are exactly the opposite of what you should be aiming for when designing the environment within which you'll be fighting the Flood. The Covenant are always a fantastic enemy to fight, with variety in their ranks, strengths and weaknesses, and some of the best AI in the business. They are always really entertaining to go head to head with, no matter where you fight them. Unfortunately, that is not the case with the Flood. They can be a welcome change of pace, an enemy which is more about crowd management rather than the conventional tactics used against the Covenant, but it is also fair to say that they are more one note. A lot of your time spent fighting them will likely involve backing away while shooting as you do your best not to be surrounded, and while they were a welcome change at first in Combat Evolved, it became clear over time that in terms of gameplay they lacked depth. Bungie did give them an upgrade in Halo 3, adding pure forms to the mix, and while that certainly made a difference, they still weren't engaging enough that they were a match for the Covenant. If you have an enemy that is by design fairly repetitive, then the worst thing you can do is put them in environments which are equally so, except that is what always seemed to happen. Rather than focusing on making the places you come face to face with the Flood in more interesting to make the experience of fighting them less tedious, Bungie often doubled down on the repetition, which didn't really work. The Library and Sacred Icon's endless grey hallways and Cortana's flood-covered corridors are the examples I'd point to as being the worst of what is already a bad bunch in this regard, but there are so many levels you can point to which suffer from similar. If I were to bring the Flood back, one of the first things I'd look at was how levels could be structured to avoid boredom creeping in, and I'd focus on making them aesthetically distinct too. The Flood may not be the most varied enemy in the world, but that doesn't mean what's built around them has to be equally monotonous. Instead, the opposite should be true. Last but certainly not least, after the introduction, gameplay and level design have all been nailed, there's still the small question of the narrative around the Flood. A serious amount of consideration needs to be put into this. During the Halo trilogy, the Flood were fantastic. They were terrifying, threatening, and powerful in equal measure. From 2 onwards, they also gained a proper personality thanks to the introduction of the Gravemind, which helped them transition smoothly from mindless monsters to something far more terrible.
Your prophets have promised you freedom from a doomed existence. But you will find no salvation on this ring. Those who built this place knew what they wrought. Do not mistake their intent, or all will perish as they did before.
If you're familiar with the series' expanded lore outside the games, then you'll be aware of what the Flood are truly capable of, and it is staggering. They can overrun galaxies, end entire civilizations, and assimilate all life as we know it. When at full power, they are nigh on unbeatable, hence the need for the various installations in the first place. But in Bungie's trilogy, they were eventually defeated, and this poses a problem, as bringing them back only for them to be overcome a second time will likely be the straw that breaks the camel's back when it comes to the Flood being seen as a threat. They sort of have to lose, as otherwise there will be nothing left, but also if they do so again, the fear they instill will further be diluted. One way of solving this would be to somehow figure out a way in story terms of having the Flood win to some degree, at least temporarily, to re-establish them as the biggest threat the galaxy has ever seen. The other would be to keep them contained to shorter stories, smaller outbreaks on planets here and there which are eventually contained, so that as a whole they aren't made to look even weaker. I'm sure there are plenty of other ways of getting the story right I've not thought of, but however it's done, it needs to be written with the greatest of care. To conclude, there are 4 things I think whoever brings back the Flood will need to absolutely nail. First, they need to be reintroduced thoughtfully with a proper amount of build-up, as the suspense leading up to their reveal is where the strongest horror will be found. Second, they need to integrate properly into Halo's Sandbox. And third, they need to be fought in levels which move away from using mostly narrow corridors which aren't visually distinctive. Finally, the story around them needs to be incredibly tight in order for them to remain the galactic threat they should be. If these 4 factors are accounted for early on in development, I think they make for a very strong foundation upon which the Flood's glorious return can be built. That's if, and this is a big if, we ever see them again. Thanks for watching the video, boys, girls and Spartans. If you had a floody good time, do consider liking, subscribing and sharing your thoughts in the comments, and hopefully we'll meet again soon.